I know, I gotta see if I get sitters.
All right, everyone, thank you for joining us for our February LEPC. For those of you who don't kind of know how we've restructured the LEPC, we obviously have our general meetings that happen quarterly, and then during the off months, which this is an off month, we work on a project specific topic, and we have started the kickoff of doing our all hazard mitigation plan for that 5-year review. So this month, we're going to be discussing the risk assessment for Kootenai County and gathering information to inform the risk assessment for the all hazard mitigation plan. So thank you for all being here today. As you may have noticed when you walked in the room, we have a whiteboard with some sticky notes, and we're just trying to get a visual aid for everybody to list the top 3 hazards in their community. So you'll just write your jurisdiction on the sticky note and put it on the top 3 ones that you think are a threat to your community. And that'll kind of help inform some of our discussion today. There was also some handouts on the back table that we'll be doing at the end for an activity. If you didn't get them, you can pick them up at any time, but we'll be working on those toward the end of our discussion today. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Long, our preparedness coordinator here at Kootenai County, and she's going to be walking us through the risk assessment and what we're going to be discussing today.
Thanks, Jean. Before I get started, Mark or Brian, let's talk about, can you guys see the screen for the presentation?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. Like Tiffany said, my name is Sarah Long, and thank you guys for coming. And I see that you all survived the ice rink in the parking lot, so you passed the first test. Welcome in. I'm sure a lot of you have heard me say this before, but we have started to do all of our emergency plans in-house, which has proved successful. We've heard mostly good feedback, but it's really proven successful for us. We are now more understanding of our plans. We're making them more intentional. We're removing a lot of the fluff, and by doing it in-house, it means that we're not using a contractor. And so by that, we're saving a lot of time as well. Many of you might not know, but to update these plans, they can cost anywhere from $70,000 to $90,000 starting. So they're pretty hefty. The all hazard mitigation plan is currently adopted by Kootenai County and local jurisdictions. The last update was in 2020, and it is required to update every 5 years. And so by that, it is set to expire in December 2025. So we are starting this process. It is not just us doing the update. We are in coordination with an extensive and comprehensive planning team. It's composed of a lot of different disciplines, so we're making sure we get input from all fronts. So jumping into that, a lot of people may already know this, but for some of those who are asking what is a hazard mitigation plan, we have the AHMP, which is the all hazard mitigation plan. That's what we currently have. It's a lot more broad and comprehensive. It focuses on all hazards that could impact Kootenai County. And there's the AHMP, it's just a hazard mitigation plan. It's a little bit more for specific hazards. But one of the primary focuses of a hazard mitigation plan is to identify those risk hazards and pretty much just the weakness for our communities. From that, we also develop the mitigation strategies to strengthen those weaknesses and fill those gaps. It aids in faster recovery time in case a disaster does happen. And it reduced costs after disasters. And I learned this yesterday, but for every dollar spent on mitigation, $6 in recovery and response costs are saved. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you get into the millions, that's detrimental. And then lastly, it is required for certain disaster relief and mitigation funding. A lot of you might be asking what mitigation actually is. After scouring the internet, there's a lot of descriptions and different information describing what mitigation is, but to simply put it, it is to make something less harmful, unpleasant, or bad. But more specifically, what we're talking about today is hazard mitigation, which is primarily taking the action to reduce or prevent damage that disasters can cause. A few examples of this are strengthening infrastructure in homes to make them more resilient, creating better drainage systems to prevent floods. I know we've seen a lot of that in the past week. We have the dike in Cataldo, which is a mitigation project through the Army Corps of Engineers. We have our Fire Smart program, which helps reduce wildfire risk by lessening a lot of the dry and damaged trees that are more susceptible to catching fire. And we have the current mitigation project through the North Kootenai Water and Sewer District for helping them build a generator. So that way, if there is a prolonged power outage, their water system is not susceptible to it and is able to come back onto service. There are 4 different types of mitigation actions. We have planning, which is primarily to just raise standards of development. Natural systems to minimize impact to the environment. We have infrastructure, so just raising the standard for building infrastructure, making it more resilient and stronger. And then we have education, which is what we're doing year round, is just promoting preparedness to the community. So the mitigation planning process looks a little bit like this, more generalized, but to identify the planning team and organize resources is the first step. We've already done so. We have our planning team, and for the past couple months, we began to accumulate our resources and kind of create a game plan. Right now, we're kind of at the beginning of step 2, which is the risk assessment, which is why you all are here today. We're going to begin gathering that data. We've also started to initiate the conversation with jurisdictions and get their data for their specific annexes. From then, we will just gather all that information and develop a hazard profile. We will identify mitigation strategies, then combat those risks and hazards that were identified in each community, adopt the plan and implement the plan, and begin working on those mitigation strategies. Why you all are here is for information for the risk assessment. What that kind of looks like is initially we first identify those hazards, the risks, the potential threats to our community. This is also based off of historic data and location specific risks. We then assess those vulnerabilities, so at-risk populations and infrastructure. What those impacts look like to economy, population, and the environment, the severity and likelihood of those hazards. All of that compiled then supports how we designate those risk levels. So how we prioritize those risks is based off of probability, impact, historical data, and what we get from the community and our stakeholders. All of that goes into how we identify what is the priority threat for our community. With that, just to kind of give some reference, this is our 2020 risk assessment. I know it's a little hard to see, but it is in our 2020 all hazard mitigation plan. Just so you can see, the top 5 assessed risks were wildfire, winter weather, flooding, windstorm, and earthquake. So our community is constantly growing. The risks are going to change as well. So while this data might have been accurate in 2020, it might have changed drastically to now. That is something to keep in mind, that we already have this data as a baseline. What I want you all to keep in mind is that when we're doing this, when we're trying to gather this information, think about what's changed in the past 4 or 5 years since 2020. So that's why a lot of these identified hazards could change, because the priorities might have changed since then. We might have had more historical data, more things happen, and that's why we're gathering your input to see if this is still accurate or what needs to be changed. So let's get into the fun stuff. We're just going to have a little open table discussion. Everybody feel free to answer. But we just want to pick your brains and kind of see where your priorities lie and what your ideas are regarding the threats and hazards for our communities and your specific communities. So if you all partook in the exercise this morning, as you can see over there on the board, we had you put little sticky notes on where you think the top 3 hazards are in your community. So kind of looking at that, and with the question, what types of natural or human-made hazards do you think are the biggest threats to Kootenai County? How are we all feeling about that? It looks like wildfire, extreme weather, and I can't read. Windstorm are the top 3. Yeah.
I think one that there's really nobody put it down, but I think one that maybe is number 4 would be hazmat.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because of the rail traffic that we have going through Kootenai County, as well as the highway traffic. And one of the things we need to keep in mind is that with the growth in population, our traffic on our infrastructure is increasing exponentially. And therefore, the risk of incidents on those roads, I think, is increasing as well. And with the amount of road traffic, when you start getting the population we have, and everybody's driven some of these roads and know what a challenge it is at certain times of the day, I think that's something that we need to make sure that we consider is what has growth in the last 10 years, 5 years done as far as what these risks are. And the same with wildfire, because we now have more residences,
More exposure.
more exposure in the urban interface.
So I think, to Larry's point, this activity is for us to kind of understand what the perceived risk is. So we did this to kind of just start this conversation to see, okay, just kind of that first shot, what is the perceived risk in Kootenai County? Then we take this information, and to Larry's point, we look at infrastructure exposed and population exposed. So based off of that conversation, obviously, yeah, hazmat. Okay, how much of our population is exposed through the railroads we have going through Kootenai County? I don't know, 20%, or this is a shot in the dark number, right? So this is the kind of conversation we want to have. And I think that you're definitely on the right track with that. I think that one of the things that I don't perceive changing would be wildfire ranking in our top 3, if not top 1, because if you look at the definition of what a WUI is, a wildland urban interface,
County.
the entire county falls within that WUI. So we talk about population exposed and infrastructure exposed, that'd be near 100%, right? With the exclusion of what, Coeur d'Alene, maybe like downtown Coeur d'Alene, or
Maybe pieces of the prairie.
yeah, maybe pieces of the prairie, but for the most part, you're probably running what, 90% exposure?
Problem.
Yeah, so that's awesome. I'm glad you brought that up, because if you look, like, the perceived risk to hazmat on there didn't even warrant a sticky note, right?
Right.
Right.
So do we want to have some conversation about hazmat specifically? Does anybody have any other thoughts on hazmat ranking and where we think that perceived risk versus actual risk, kind of that dichotomy?
If you would have asked me to pick my top 4, number 4 would have been hazmat, only because of the potential with the railroad, mixed loads, how much product comes through here, maybe low frequency, but it'd be high consequence.
That is one thing we do have to keep in consideration when we eventually develop this data, is not only the impact, but the probability. And so I think that's why a lot of people get concerned why certain risks are not higher up on the chart because of the probability. But these are all things that we take into consideration when we have higher population. Probability, of course, increases.
So what do we think our population increase? Some of you might know this, but from 2020 to 2025, sorry, have we had population increase in specific areas concentrated in the county, or has it been countywide? Excuse me.
I think there's been growth countywide.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's countywide, and, you know, one of the things we're looking at is as we get more people, the housing, the lack of housing and available housing, particularly for lower income or first-time buyers, is really difficult. And that one of the ways that they can do that is by moving further out. Okay, because it's not such prime property. And by doing that, you increase your exposure in the WUI for the wildfire, as well as maybe to some extent on the road infrastructure. Not as much maybe, because they aren't going to be near 95, they aren't going to be near 50, 53 or 54. But it could impact them if there's an incident in impacting their ability to ingress and egress to their properties. And that's just a thought for consideration.
So with increased population, and this would be a question for my law enforcement partners in the room, does that have increased crime rates? Are we seeing that? That would lead to increased concerns for civil unrest, active shooter, and what's the other one up there, terrorism? Is that something that we're concerned about with the population increase? Does the risk, perceived risk for those, or known risk for those increase?
Well, it should. Let me address the hazmat thing that he was talking about here, just real briefly though. So in our city, we've population increased about 15,000 under the time frame that you're talking about. And the hazmat incident, even so far as that we're talking about a semi, for instance, that rolls over something like that in the population area, is a big deal. I've worked those in my previous life a bunch. And so that does have a pretty big impact. And with 95 going through right through the middle of town, as well as I-90 and that sort of thing, I think there is a significant risk there. Back to your question, the increase in population doesn't always result in an increase in crime. It kind of depends on the area itself and that sort of thing. In our jurisdiction, for instance, we've actually seen a huge reduction in crime over the past 10 years. But with that, you were asking about active shooter. We deal with the active shooter threat almost weekly. On average, over the past couple of years, it's been about every 10 days of school. We receive another threat, but we are working one today and we worked 2 last week. The only reason I think that we haven't had one is because our students feel comfortable enough talking with our SROs that we're able to go and snatch the kids before it actually happens. But it happens a lot more frequently than the average public knows. Like I said, the school district and us, we don't put out all these things because they happen so frequently. Like I said, there's one happening today and I honestly doubt that they'll be impressed about it just because it was mitigated so quickly.
Back in
Well,
twenty
that
twenty,
doesn't
how
mean-
often was there a threat? Or like how often was there an active shooter threat in 2020 compared to now?
I don't know if it's really changed that much, honestly. Our school population, I think, has grown just a bit, but not as crazy as maybe the overall population of the county. The number of school threats, I don't know if it's changed that much, and honestly, I really don't have any data one way or the other. I would tell you though, my personal opinion, and I think this is echoed by my friends across in law enforcement across the county, I don't know if active shooter was placed on a high enough risk during the last assessment that we did. And that was probably our fault. Maybe we didn't put it high enough. I think it was at a 4 or something like that before. So I guess they changed. I don't know if it's really been there, but maybe we didn't rank it high enough last time.
I would ask, is there something that putting it on that chart like at a 1? I didn't know that either. I was completely unaware that you guys were going to go in. Or the threat. That's wild.
Why do you think that is, that there's that frequency? Just social media, like,
A whole bunch of reasons. Yeah, social media certainly plays a part into it. We have some kids who are bullied and feel disgruntled. There's actually a whole bunch of social media sites that I can point to that actually encourage this sort of thing. And then you have some people that just think this is the only way to get attention. There's a whole bunch of different reasons. But when it comes to, site hardening or that sort of thing, or especially training with response to, and especially the aftermath of an active shooter. I don't know how many in the room have been involved in one, but I would tell you it is extremely difficult to navigate. I would also say that I think our first responders would do an amazing job at the initial response and putting the threat down. But then afterwards, all the crap that comes with the mitigation afterwards, that is a nightmare to navigate. And it's not a 1 or 2 day process. We are talking weeks and weeks and weeks to get through all that. And then the coordination that's required between, almost everyone in the room to get something like that completed, regardless of where it occurs, is a big deal.
so you'd say the gap would lie in like family assistance and recovery efforts after the fact?
Yeah.
And what about reunification? Is that something reunification, is that something that we still have a gap with?
Yes, we have plans drawn up to deal with it, but I don't know if they've really been exercised to the degree that we would feel comfortable with.
I think your recovery is a big part of that.
It is.
Because you're talking weeks or months maybe to go through recovery, especially the psychological recovery.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that's a good point.
I know the response is fast, but is there a mitigation, something we can do, mitigation on the front side that we could maybe put on one of these pages that would help?
There might be. So there's a bunch of things that I think the school has considered over the years to, harden their targets. But I don't know how much of this group can really assist with that. A lot of that is extremely expensive. So the school district really is mostly
Like physical security measures, is that what you're talking about? Okay.
Yeah.
And that's why we do encourage jurisdictions to participate in this plan, because it does open them up for mitigation funding depending on what it is. And
Well, and it's helpful for us when we look at the state Homeland Security grant program, right, on what potential applications should be coming through. We did support Coeur d'Alene School District, what was that, a couple years ago with getting security cameras for their school. So that is something that we have done. But obviously that's one school in the
And those have
county.
been very helpful.
Awesome.
Tiffany, the county is working on a jail impact fee, and so they've come up with a bunch of crime statistics to support that impact fee as far as the population grows, the jail population is growing. Maybe overall crime, it might be down, but at least those arrestable offenses, they are saying are corresponding with population growth. So I don't know if any of those statistics might be helpful for you.
would you be able to share, do you have that information?
It's not, I don't believe it's finalized yet because they had to do a complete rewrite of it. So, but I know that they were working on it.
Okay, we'll look
And
into that.
I can reach out to Commissioner Matarin if he's the one that's fronting that.
I'll touch base with you then about that, because that sounds interesting.
Any other hazards based off of, yeah,
I have a question. Does active shooter only apply to school district?
no, it could
No,
So that.
No, I
like,
worked one in a hospital before.
Yeah.
Yeah,
community
I
gathering.
had 2 at the big box stores. We had one in Target, one in Walmart.
and then,
Previous jurisdictions, so Places immune, yeah,
Anywhere.
gather more than say 50 people on a regular
Festivals.
basis.
But that's just, the schools are where you're seeing the most activity. That's what you're
Yeah,
saying.
schools and hospitals, yes.
Tiffany, can we jump back to hazmat real
Yes,
quick
we
for just a
can.
minute? It doesn't change my ranking, but something that maybe we should capture in that, because I think it's an additional thing since the last plan that's just gonna become more prevalent is lithium batteries. We're to the point now where pretty much any structure fire, we have to report to the state as a hazmat incident.
Okay. What's and I'm ignorant to this, but what's the threat for that for the community, like with lithium batteries? What
Just the fire.
exposure?
Well, you've got fire and you've got toxic chemicals too. If people recall, just in the news in the last week, they had fire over in Spokane and they had to do an evacuation because of the toxicity of
Airborne.
airborne toxicity coming from that.
Federal government have to go into
Yeah, the
California
one
and
in
LA to go inspect every single one of those batteries that were on electric cars after the wildfires went
Yeah,
through.
well, California has brought it to light. The fact that you can't put the fires out necessarily. Now it's almost to a point of stand back and watch it burn because it's less of a environmental impact than having all that water run off with those contaminants.
But the foam is the only way to put it out, right? Or no?
No,
Not even the
You have
foam?
to smother it. So blankets are becoming popular.
That's hard to do.
They haul dumpsters around in some places full of water and they just, with a crane, will pick a car up and set it in that dumpster full of water.
That'll be a really interesting add
Yeah.
to the plan, I think.
Awesome.
Is there anything else on hazmat?
Yeah, I've got a question. So as far as our response capability to a decent hazmat, like accident, do we have much up here?
We have a regional team, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but like if it was an immediate, either chlorine gas or organose phosphate, I don't think we can respond very rapidly.
Actually, we can. For the fire districts are well versed in how to respond to that, and they have other resources that can respond quickly, such as Burlington Northern. And Dan, you can probably, or any of the other fire chiefs can probably speak to that better because I've been out of it now for a few years. But, you know, I know in the past, we've had a pretty robust ability to respond quickly and initially set up exclusion zones. You know, that's pretty easy for even people that aren't specifically trained as experts in response, but they have at least an awareness or operational level to where they can set up those exclusion zones.
So the capability gap with hazmat, what would we say is the biggest capability gap? Like,
Well, hey, Dan.
Yes.
Quick question. Our state hazmat team, where are we?
So the governor.
Right, you know where I'm going with
Yeah.
this.
The governor, and I don't remember how many millions of dollars, the
8
governor
million.
has put in the budget
8
to
million.
stand 8 million.
Yeah.
To stand the regional teams back up because funding has been so lacking for all of them for so long that they're almost non-existent. So the governor has realized through some meetings and that the importance of those regional teams. And once the budget gets passed, then there will be money to stand these teams back up, get their equipment back in the condition it should be in, have more money for training and it's then supposed to be carried on instead of a one-time we'll fix it and then forget about it again. It's supposed to continue on with some maintenance funding.
okay,
On the front side, though, the county's very prepared to contain any hazmat.
okay.
I mean,
So let's move to windstorm then, because that ranked pretty high too. I mean, I think a couple months into becoming director, I had the first experience with a presidential declared disaster, and it was the January windstorm. And I know the partners who that impacted the most, and the reason we were able to get that presidential declaration was because Kootenai Electric, sustained millions of dollars of damage, correct? So our perceived risk for windstorm is high. We had a significant storm in 2015 as well, another one in 2021. What would we say our response capabilities to that is, and where are the gaps? And is that still a relevant one to risk high because we perceive it to be high? Is it high?
I think,
Thoughts, comments?
I think it needs to be high, but I think the lack is in training. I know the last windstorm I responded to, I had a state patrol officer cutting trees off of power lines that he didn't know if were live or not. That's a way to get killed. And I think training is the huge issue on our response. And I don't know, Tom, if you'd agree with that or not.
Well, training is an issue. I mean, Chris could even attest to it, but we do come across with our crews, people cutting trees off the lines. They're like, well, I'm out of power, but still I think we've learned over the last 4 or 5 windstorms. I mean, I think we're pretty well geared to respond to those if we need
And
to.
on the utility.
On the
side,
utility side, yeah, we have mutual aid agreements in place and all of that. It's just time is what it.
And Vista, do you feel similarly?
That's recovery though.
That's recovery.
I think the lack is in the initial response because it's not gonna be the power utilities that get there first. It's gonna be those first responders.
Can I respond to
Yeah, yes.
that? The highway districts are the ones that get the phone call first because emergency services can't get there. So, I don't know, there's a lack of response. I mean, we got a pretty big staff amongst the rural highway districts in Kootenai County. And I think we do a pretty good job out there, but windstorms are certainly a big thing. We were severely impacted with the 2015 windstorm and we're able to get on that funding for that. So I think it needs to rate high because, your road access throughout Kootenai County is really going to be limited when the full of trees.
Well, it's not just that. I agree with you. 2015 was a damn nightmare. All the majors, all the major intersections in Kootenai County obviously lose power when something like that happens. And so we had an incredible amount of accidents on 95 and some of those were injury accidents. So it's not just that we're out of power, it's the impact of that as it relates to the motoring public, at least for law enforcement. I don't want our guys out there cutting trees down, but there's too many intersections for us to frankly get out there and control just because I don't have an adequate number of bodies. And so we're talking mitigation strategies, some way to continue that power to some of those intersections through battery or something like that. Battery backup is huge in my opinion. So that we can get emergency services where they need to go and we don't have people still crashing and getting hurt in the meantime.
The training part of it's good too. I know we do training with the Vista. Sometimes we put that with KDC, but the training of our crews that respond to these and directly and then go with the power line down. There's trees not up in it. So our guys know not to get into them and provide access to the utilities to get out there too.
What about the fire side?
From what standpoint? I
Like,
mean,
what's your biggest impact when we have windstorms? Is it just call volume?
the same as PD, just not enough bodies for all the stuff going on and we assist each other. I was just telling him his group does a fantastic job locating, getting into us. We work well as far as getting to the most important calls first and skipping some of the ones that can wait. We just kind of work between each other and tackle all of them, but there's just too many. That's the problem.
In 2015, Lakes was opening up the backside of Hayden Lake so we could get to the houses that had trees on top of them. So, I mean, obviously,
Mitigation really is staff and backhoes. That's been a big thing for me pushing my commissioners. Me and people backhoe usually 3 or 4, so we have 3 of them now since that one.
Just like example, down south in hurricanes, that's where I came from, is the firefighters and police, they work together in natural disaster, especially because I came from a city department, we all work together. Get trees out of the way, open the traffic, we post firefighters at some of the intersections to help with traffic, because the law enforcement officers doing other things as well, so.
well, that brings up a solid point. So the last windstorm we had that affected Hayden area, law enforcement, SO was responding to the same calls we were responding to. And ultimately it was conflicting information because they had already been through that intersection, confirmed that the tree was down at that intersection. It wasn't involving power lines. And then we got towed out to that same intersection. So we're kind of working double duty. So I don't know how we can improve maybe the communication side of things in those windstorms where we're not all being dispatched to the exact same call.
So a common operating
What we've
picture.
done is exactly that. So
Yeah, we open up our EOC when we know a windstorm's coming, several hours before, and then we'll staff it with us and then also streets department. And so we can try to use our personnel a little bit more efficiently.
And not to combat that, but in the rural fire districts, where, you know, you look at the north end of it, where you got Hauser responding, you've got Northern Lakes responding, you've got, you know, Spirit Lake, Timberlake, and SO through their jurisdictions responding. A common EOC is sometimes challenging. It's easier, obviously, in the city aspect, but now you take multiple rural fire districts with the sheriff's department, and in the case of highway districts, where you've got, you know, 4 highway districts that are all trying to encompass that, is a little more challenging.
No, I agree with you. This is probably the best format for.
And we can leverage this, but I think in those situations, somebody has to make that request of, this is what's occurring and we need to utilize this asset. And I think we've really worked, because I heard the horror stories from 2015. When we are aware of the potentiality, messaging that out. I know some of my fire partners, when I know there's a big windstorm, we message that out. Same with flooding. And so I think for the OEM side of things, we just need to be made aware when we're getting to a trigger point where that additional support is needed for us to leverage these larger resources, because they're definitely there for that purpose.
One of the other dangers for windstorm is just how much it makes everything else worse, right? So if you have a wet spring, all the trees fall over. If it's a really extreme cold, they all snap and fall over. If it's a wildfire, it goes 5 times faster. So it's just one of those things where it just makes everything worse.
Is there any reason we couldn't stand this EOC up to support what Tyler's saying and coordinate those efforts there?
There's
Even I think there might be a lack of.
The request just has to come in for us to be able to support you guys, and then obviously you would need to have the liaisons present, right? Like that, and that's a staffing issue too. So that's a conversation of where do we put those resources and how do we partner?
We already partially activated with citizen inquiry, so it's already part of the way there. We just have to set this stuff up.
You know, and I think that's the key is we're very fortunate up here in that law enforcement, fire, EMS, the highway districts, we all have a great relationship as far as working together. I know, you know, it's really, I think, an anomaly nationwide sometimes. But I think a way that this plan could maybe help that would be look at ways of increasing a more robust intercommunications a little further ahead of the game than in a reactionary late in the game.
Crazy how everything always revolves around communication being like the sole
Amazing.
issue. So crazy.
Well, Tiffany, who activates that? Because we waited before to find out when you guys are gonna activate the EOC, and then we send Todd as our liaison.
So that's a great question. Who activates the EOC? The decision to activate the EOC is based upon the information I'm being provided and the request for it to become activated.
So someone else has to.
Somebody else has to initiate. It's the same like with a disaster declaration, for example. I don't unilaterally decide that we've reached the disaster declaration threshold. For example, KEC reached out and said, this is the situation. These are the damages sustained. This is the need. I take that information and I advise my policy group, which is the Board of Commission and the sheriff, and have that conversation. And 9 times out of 10, whatever recommendation I make is the recommendations that's followed. So if all of my responders are saying the EOC needs to be activated, or preemptively, we'd like to activate the EOC because we're seeing that there's a potentiality for this to become bigger, we can do that. It doesn't cost us any funding to utilize this space and bring the stakeholders to the room. It's just that conversation of making the request for me to have an informed conversation.
I think the earlier we can do that, the better.
That's what I was trying to get at.
I think, you know, if you get from the weather service that, hey, tomorrow we're looking at getting in 60, 70 mile an hour winds, maybe what you do is a couple of hours before that is expected to hit, you send out a notification that, hey, you know, we may activate, and if it starts to hit, go ahead and activate or have that conversation so you can activate.
Well, and it's also practice. I think one of the things that I'm cautious with is I never want to be redundant to the efforts that are going out on the field. My role is to support the first responders, and the utilization of the EOC is to support the first responders. So I need that intel to make that decision based upon their needs. So I'm not going to unilaterally just say the EOC is active because I'd like it to be. It's because there is a need and it has been illustrated, or a desire and it has been illustrated. So just so long as we have that conversation and we're working in support with our first responders on the field, that's when we'll see success of the EOC utilized. But if it's working parallel to, it won't be successful. So
question to Larry's point, because he's going there, in your planning efforts at the county level or for the EOC, do you have a decision-making matrix that has certain criteria?
Yeah, so we have different levels of activation and we're always on kind of that initial monitoring. OEM staff, we monitor the situation, but then the requests are made based upon a partial activation or a full activation. So yes, that exists and that's in our EOC SOP, and that's also just part of my staff's training as well and our volunteers.
I'm just wondering, what are you monitoring? So like from the highway district's perspective, sheriff's dispatch will call our list of guys out through the night or. So are you monitoring?
So Sarah has access to CAD and we do monitor CAD. She's a dispatcher, so her previous position was a dispatcher. So we now have that knowledge of understanding how to utilize CAD, and we have conversations with dispatch. We're under the sheriff's office's OEM, so we have an open line of communication with our deputies in the field on a regular basis. And then the other part of that is just the people in those disciplines providing us the information as well. Because for example, I won't know what Northern Lakes is dealing with unless it's in CAD and we're monitoring it. But if there's something specific they need help or support with, they would have to reach out and provide us that information for that bigger common operating picture to be there. And same with the highway districts.
I think one of the challenges with windstorms is the duration. They come and go so quick.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's unlike a wildfire where, okay, we've got a wildfire that's kicked up, it's starting to grow, we're not able to get a handle on it, able to stand up the EOC. But when it comes to the wind events, I mean, you might be 15 minutes for 7 days of devastation that you've got to clean up after.
Well, and I think that's where we have to shift our focus a little bit. It's no, on windstorms specifically, it's not so much that initial response, but it's the recovery and the aftermath, because there are organizations we can reach out to bring us additional help. Like, for example, Team Rubicon reaches out every time we have a windstorm and they say, hey, do you need support on mucking or cutting trees or doing X, Y, and Z? And they will offer that. But if we don't have the information to say, actually, this community was impacted and we need to send them there, then we don't necessarily know. And we do our best to remain available and aware, but.
What's Rubicon?
It's a national volunteer organization made up of veterans who do things like cutting down trees and mucking out,
They'll do
for
a
disaster response and recovery efforts.
You know, I think this is a great conversation because it applies not only to windstorm, but you take something like, you know, we don't get very many earthquakes, okay? Even though there was a couple here in the last month, but they were pretty small. But if we got one, it's gonna be the same thing that the chief was referring to, is it's gonna be very quick, short, be over, but it's gonna cause a huge impact in what your response is because of the amount of damage that may happen, the roads that may be impacted due to debris or whatever, you know, or damage to
And
the
a
road.
capability gap across the board, I would say, is recovery. I think we are
Yeah.
really good with response as a whole. Fire knows what to do, law enforcement knows what to do. But when it comes to recovery, there's a little bit of hesitancy in time and space that's given when, if we were a little bit more organized or utilize the resources in the EOC, we could make decisions a little bit more preemptively to speed that process up. So this is all really good conversation. And it also sounds like there needs to be a little bit more training and understanding of how and when to utilize the EOC and what support we can give. So that's something we'll look at as well.
Would that be beneficial to do it in LEPC, or do you think it'd be like an all-day specific type of training? I think you should do a separate training, separate from this, so that we can bring other people from our jurisdictions that might need to understand.
Funny enough, the IEMC is coming up too. The Integrated Emergency
Hint.
Management course that's at the end of the month. And that will provide some of that context as well. But I do think something standalone could be beneficial for people who might not have as much time. Like
Day 2, we will be talking about the EOC, so sign up.
Well, and I think that's important because you're not always gonna have the chief of the department being the one that has to make that decision, because he might be off. It might be a subordinate. And I mean, even down to just the boots on the ground, you know, so I think that's where that training might need to expand a little bit.
I guess I'll play off of that with boots on the ground, and resources, you know, part of one of our issues is, you know, we're physically on the ground, and to the extent that, you know, if we're trying to open a road as an example, we don't know how much of that road is really closed beyond where we can be at a certain point. So when it comes to, say, the sheriff's helicopter, is that something that maybe should be thought about as far as being a resource to fly the backside of the lake.
I think a request for whatever is needed and then a conversation with those who have the authority to make those decisions. I mean, they can say no, but if you say we need this for X, Y, and Z, I think there'd be an adaptability to.
Because without us being able to get there, we don't know the extent, nor do we know if we can help.
Yeah.
Until we get there, right? Or you can visually see what the extent of the damage might be.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else on the specific risk, the perceived risks up there? Any other conversation that's wanted to be had? A severe weather, or is that extreme weather?
Which also includes winter weather and extreme heat. It will be separated, but just for the point of this conversation. It's winter weather's too, so.
Was windstorm separated in the old one? Or was it?
Yes.
Oh, number 5. Number 4. In the changes that we've seen, do we feel like winter weather is still a high risk? Or do we think we have enough ability to respond to it when we do have it through mitigation activities that have gone on throughout the years, such as enough snow plows and enough people for the highway district, right? Like, do we have enough apparatus to adequately respond to severe winter weather, or is that still something that's of major concern?
Well, I kind of consider the rain on snow melt we have right now a winter weather type thing, and I have roads washing out right now. So I'm of the mind to keep it on the priority.
I kind of viewed the windstorm and the extreme weather as the same thing, just 2 different categories. So I probably screwed that up a little bit where I put my thing up there under extreme weather. I mean, that's anyway. I kind of viewed them as the same category.
It's a
just one
chicken and the
subset of
egg
the same-
conversation, yeah. I mean, I had that with, what is there, severe thunderstorm? That was one that I was like, does that warrant its own standalone? And then we had a conversation this morning where, is severe thunderstorm really the risk, or is it the tertiary and secondary impacts of a severe thunderstorm that we're more concerned of, which leads to wildfire and utility?
We could also have that with windstorm.
I would look at all of them as the same, because the response and what we do with them afterwards is the same-ish.
Well,
That's not what this is for. This is for hazard mitigation.
Yeah, if
This
the
is not
mitigation's
about
different.
response. So it depends on what kind of mitigation
Yeah.
efforts we can do for each individual hazard.
well,
That's why
in a
it's listed.
thunderstorm, you can have wind, you could have
Right.
the rain, the flooding.
The stupid question,
You know,
how do you
whatever you
mitigate against a
want.
thunderstorm? Right.
Well, here's one of the other
Mitigating
points with
against
that.
the secondary effects, not necessarily a thunderstorm itself.
Which now is why they're in that annex, the mitigation actions are for those specific, like wildfire caused by thunderstorm.
Right.
Okay.
We've been discussing with dispatch in regards to when they dispatch out a call, then we're just gonna have a category for weather instead of breaking out weather down. And so, because ultimately, I mean, what they're getting, unfortunately, on the dispatch side before they notify us is in many cases inconsistent to truly what we're finding when we get to the scene. So what a lot of the fire agencies are doing, I know KCFR is doing the same thing. They're standing up their own internal emergency operations center. And instead of dispatching our units, they're sending all the calls to us, and then we're self-dispatching based on the information that's received for that type of call. It's easier for us to take care of it. I mean, a tree on top of a house is completely different than a tree across the road.
Right.
You know, a tree with power lines down starting a fire is completely different than a tree that came down and didn't affect anything. So we're able to then to modify that dispatch level to know, and it's the same thing with all weather categories.
This is one that has bugged me, and we're just gonna talk about it real quick because it bugs me. Volcanic ashfall is a hazard in the 2020 plan that has its own standalone hazard profile. And I don't think it should. And obviously, none of you feel it's a risk to our community. I'm assuming it got put in there because I wasn't around then, but in the 1980s, there was a.
Yeah, I was here for Mount St. Helens. I think we could handle that again.
So do we perceive that to be anything that needs to have a standalone annex or maybe in the plan at all?
Mention or.
Okay.
I don't know how you'd even mitigate against that. So what would be the point of putting it in?
We could issue
Broom?
masks to help with.
Masks?
But is that a public health?
That's not a mitigate. That's what I'm saying.
No,
I mean, and you guys pass it all in your
Don't use
response
the-
efforts.
I like where you're going with that.
It's all already been covered in the EOP.
That would happen in the 80s.
And that's a good point, Emily. Maybe we look at the hazards that we pulled out for the EOP and align it a little bit more.
I think that might be helpful, because if we're already preparing to respond to all those hazards in the EOP, why would we prepare to mitigate?
And align it more effectively.
One comment I got, Tiffany, in terms of your perception here, in terms of these perceived hazards, what can always improve upon is the public awareness education component for mitigation. Driving that home, especially with new populations coming in or new demographics coming into the county or just the region. I've already just saw driving up here between Sandpoint, 2 vehicles on the side of the road from black ice. Okay, so it's obviously that they're not aware of the type of environment that they're coming to.
What about earthquake being in the top 5 of the 2020 plan? Do we feel that the risk in Kootenai County to an earthquake is high enough that it should be within the top 5?
I don't think it's high enough, but I think it needs to be somewhere on the list because we do sit on a fault, you know, and it may be a remote, like maybe down near the bottom third somewhere as far as potential for it actually happening.
I think
Anybody been
probabilities-
injured by an earthquake or anything else in the past, say,
No.
decade?
Well, it's been a while. I think the last bigger one was down near Chalice.
Yes.
You know, and, you know, that was a few years ago. They just recently had a couple of them up north,
Right.
you know, but they were pretty small, you know, 2.3.
I just don't think our risk and probability is high enough for the impact to be as such that we spend a lot of time.
Yeah, the impact,
Dollars
if I remember,
on investing in infrastructure to mitigate.
Yeah, we're not gonna retrofit all of our buildings
To be,
No.
size.
If I remember right, Tiffany, going back to the 20, it was talking about Cascadia rising and the
And that's
impacts,
why it
the
re-
impacts to Kootenai County from the evacuees.
Don't we also have an impact for
Yeah.
communications and stuff when the
Yeah.
internet goes down?
That's how it got raised.
That's
Yeah.
how
That's
it
where I
got
think
raised.
it's
It was the infrastructure side of it, of how we deal with.
So the population, not the actual earthquake.
So yeah, it's
Right,
not
yeah.
necessarily.
That's what it was,
Impacts.
that's what it was geared towards during the last, when we did this.
Yeah, so that's a secondary or
It's a response
tertiary.
thing.
Yeah, Spokane County just did a thing last week I went to and it just, there's nothing you can do.
That's what you got out of it too.
Yeah,
That's
there
what I
was
got out of it too.
If I remember right, it was
You know,
the
more
fuel,
questions.
how are we gonna get fuel?
So infrastructure impacts and
Infrastructure.
lifeline impacts on utilities and things along those lines, but I don't know how you mitigate.
Make trips across the road.
When, yeah, what do utilities do to mitigate for a seismic event as they're putting stuff in the ground?
Yeah, we'll look at that. I just wanted to have that conversation too, because I understand that if Cascadia happens, we will have impacts here, but it's going to be more of aid rendering in.
Secondary.
Yeah, not,
it's not gonna be a primary.
Well,
And it
don't we,
won't be as immediate.
aren't our communications all put out of two
You know.
modes on the?
they got a 6-hour drive, right?
That was.
No, they're not gonna make it over the pass anyway, so.
Yeah. I
It's
don't think they'll be flying anytime
For us,
soon
we
either,
did.
so.
The Cascadia event will definitely stretch your supply chains.
Yeah, and
I
I
think
think,
that's what the mitigation has,
yeah,
what,
Yeah, I
practice we
think
were talking about was what were we gonna put in place should the event happen? For
Yeah, I-
backup fuel, can't remember what else. Shelters, yeah, you were part of that. remember?
so like mass care measures.
Yeah, it's gonna fall down more into your
Is that something
infrastructure
that you put
failure.
into
No.
hazard mitigation
and
plan?
things like that.
Is
Tiff, the problem with-
Yeah.
That's exactly where I was just gonna
Is
go.
that even a part of that plan, like that we're supposed to mitigate hazards by creating mass care procedures on the back end?
So it
Like, is
applies
that
to
part of
any
that
hazard.
plan? Or is that more of like your EOP plan in response, that we're supposed to have mass care?
I think that'd be more the EOP.
I think,
Well, you can't mitigate against it.
Right, that's why I'm asking, like, is
can't
mass
mitigate
care is probably not even in the fall hazard mitigation plan.
I don't think it's your role,
Okay.
right? So
Yeah.
Panhandle Health District has an ability to put shelters up. We can do a little, right? And Red Cross, it's gonna be your volunteer agencies that are gonna save you on that.
And
That's
we help
response.
support and coordination efforts, but again, it's response, it's not mitigation to your point.
That'd
But
be
I think that
Operations.
there might be a note or a clause or something, but the mitigation efforts we make in utility strengthening or infrastructure strengthening would subsequently support a response effort to ensure that those exist, so.
Cheryl wants to say something.
Yeah.
She's not very loud.
There are certain things we can do to mitigate things that we know that are the result of a Cascadia event. So for instance, the reason why OEM maintains an amateur radio group is so that, for instance, one of the things they're working on trying to do right now is set up wind links. So if the internet goes down, we have a means to communicate and send FEMA forms and photographs of damage. So there are certain things that we can do that are being put in place and we can concentrate on.
I think though, to your point, like, yes, but again, you're not mitigating against the earthquake.
No, not to stop the earthquake,
Yeah.
but.
And so this is a
but those
hazard
things.
mitigation plan and the hazard is the earthquake.
Because if your hazard was downed communication, then to mitigate against that, you'd have alternative communication.
Well, and I think that fall under utility failure,
So
right?
yeah, so maybe
That would
that
be-
should be higher.
Yeah.
On the list.
That actually really should.
What?
Sue.
Did you have something to say, Sue?
Yeah, I wanted to reiterate that. This plan needs to be about the hazards within the county.
Yep.
It's not about mitigating hazards
Elsewhere.
that created secondary effects to the counties but occurred elsewhere.
Yeah, agreed. Awesome. Well, this was great discussion, and I think we're all moving on to discussion question 1.
Yeah, really quick. Online, is there anything you guys wanted to add to the question we had about what hazards are priority in Kootenai County?
Well, hey, this is Nick. So it seems to me that the cyber, and I like the way that you listed, I can't remember how it was, but like cyber disruption / attack, because it doesn't have to be just a cyber attack. I mean, it could be old servers that are dying that the jurisdiction just doesn't have money to be able to replace those routers, servers, firewalls, whatever. And that can definitely be mitigated by, you know, having proper funding or additional grants or whatever like that to replace that hardware. And that's like a constant thing. I mean, now the windstorm, I was living up in Athol and I remember hearing those trees cracking and that was weird, but that was a long time ago. These cyber events, I mean, you know, the city of Coeur d'Alene, Kootenai Health, Rehab Hospital of the Northwest, you know, those are the kind of the known cyber attacks. But then you just have some other infrastructure like Kootenai Health, their phone system went down, and it wasn't an attack. It was just, if I remember right, it was the phone system provider did a software update that caused a problem. You had the CrowdStrike event, and we can't mitigate against somebody doing something wrong in Seattle, but in terms of preparing to be able to have, you know, proper, you know, licenses and hardware that are up to date, and, you know, staff preparedness to be able to have what they need in any jurisdiction to be able to have offline procedures. Those are things that can, you know, be mitigated for the risk. So it just seems that, you know, cyber should be much higher than, was it number 6? That's my 2 cents.
You, Nick.
I think one of the things I'd like to see when we work on this update is to kind of group together those natural hazards and then have the like cyber, naval unrest, terrorism, man-made stuff grouped together in a way too, just to show that delineation.
So the FEMA funding only come in for the man-made, for the natural ones?
Yes, but I think there's still value in having the man-made in
agree.
there to
Mitigate
illustrate
some
that there could be impacts and potentially if there's other funding streams outside of the known FEMA ones that may or may not exist in the near future. That
And
would,
you could take and put pipeline incidents under hazmat as well.
Yeah.
You know, and
yeah, we're gonna
shorten the
definitely do
list
some
of
work. But I think we'll go to the next question here. Right?
Yeah.
So question 2, so also I just want to say that was a great discussion for the first one. That was probably the most important question out of all of them. So I really am grateful for your guys' feedback. We'll just kind of get into a little bit of these questions. There's quite a few more and I still have an activity for you guys to do, but I want to make sure you guys get out on time. So the second one, are there specific areas in Kootenai County that you believe are more at risk for hazards such as flooding zones or wildfire prone areas? Guys, we're doing so great.
For example, is Cataldo at risk for what hazard?
Flooding.
Ah, look at that.
I should have made this a pop quiz.
I think it falls into both flooding and wildfire, both because we've got a lot of forest in that.
I always get called callous for this, but there's just not that many people impacted by it. When you look at the total.
What was
population.
that? Sorry.
The population that's impacted by those.
By Cataldo flooding?
Yeah, it's.
Yeah, there's a lot of mitigation already been done.
Not a lot of people. If it goes terrible, it's still not a lot of people when you consider your whole population.
No, but it still really sucks for them.
It does.
When it takes out the roads, then a lot of people are impacted.
Yeah, and 90 goes through there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Aren't you building a bridge though? Like a new bridge?
All three bridges are in process of getting replaced. And they'll be a little safer, but still, if you had a 500-year event come through, you're gonna lose all the east-west connections in Kootenai County.
You know, I think if you wanted to define an area, you could say anywhere outside of the core area where, you know, like.
The metro area?
Yeah.
You get up prairie, flooding's a risk.
Well, they had Lake 41 the other day.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other specific locations in the county that we think warrant a little bit more emphasis on their,
About the lakes,
the lakes, all of them, all the lakes? Okay.
when Spirit Lake, there's a lot of population that live out there. Had several road slides and failures, and lots of trees down and all the power lines.
When we speak about roads, like that's obviously very vital and important in the infrastructure that we have. Is it pretty susceptible and aging that we currently have in Kootenai County, or is there like to landslides or road closed? Like what's the biggest risk on our overall like main arteries, or you where I'm trying to go with that question at all?
Floods and weather.
Floods and weather on the road infrastructure.
Yeah, floods and windstorms are what shut us down.
When some of the road infrastructure issues come where we've only got that one point of ingress egress that are serving a group of properties. And we've got multitudes of those. I mean, even some of them where we have the 2 points of ingress egress, obviously a tree falls on the south side of Hayden Lake and a tree falls on the north side of Hayden Lake, everybody's cut off on the backside.
So
Twin
from-
Lakes, yeah, now it's Twin Lakes, you're cut off. I mean, something big happens that, you know, quarter mile into Twin Lakes Road, you're cut off.
So from the wildland side of things, when we're talking about wildfire, would you say one of the larger mitigation activities we could be focusing on is ingress egress? Is that like the main concern, or are there other mitigation? I'm skipping ahead, Sarah, I'm sorry. Are there other mitigation activities specific to wildfire that would be of?
Well, I think you're already doing some of them in fuels reduction.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And I think that just needs to be maintained as much as possible.
I don't really think that there's anything you can do about a tree down the road. It's just gonna happen.
Cut it on the way.
Yeah, I mean, unless you
Not all
clear
the
every
trees.
road for 30 feet, 40 feet even wouldn't even be enough. I mean, it's not plausible.
Yeah, the mitigation part is a little challenging. I mean, even trying to get more roads put in, how do we get more roads put in? I mean,
It's not very thoughtful when you just say.
no,
more
and
roads.
it's not cost effective, unfortunately. Who's gonna fit the bill?
Right away to widen the corridors out.
What about evacuation signage? Is that something that would have value for a mitigation action?
Yeah, the pre-planning of the evacuation routes. I mean, we always know when you look at Paradise, California, that was one of the biggest problems they had was where do people go? They were midsummer population. We have the same thing. We have our transient population increase that occurs every summer. All the VRBOs around the lakes, and those people don't know where to go in emergency evacuation. So that notification is huge for them.
You know, you might want to reach out to Montana, because when I was working with the incident management team, one thing I saw firsthand was that through their STAR law enforcement program and whatnot, they have evacuation dialed in for a lot of their counties. Basically, the sheriff came out, handed his deputies, each one got a separate folder that had all the identifications on the routes, you know, who's in there, who might need medical assistance, and the whole bit. They really got it dialed in pretty well. So you might reach out to some of those folks for some suggestions.
How about message reader boards? I know we have a few of those, but certainly I know Free doesn't go very far.
Well, there's a rental right there on 53 where you could probably rent 10 or 15 of them. if you need to.
We just did evacuations a couple years ago in Medical Lake, cause that massive fire over there. and
Yeah, that's true.
It was not the greatest procedure, I know, cause I was evacuated during that fire and it sucked. And then we had a whole bunch of crime happen on a bunch of homes that were there and it was just not great. So I don't know if reaching out to them and seeing what their problems were that we could
Like what their after action.
yeah, that we could try to mitigate going forward since they literally just did it.
Yeah,
And that was Spokane Sheriff.
I think that
covers
comes to,
Lake.
training and exercising it too, like
Yeah.
having the plan identifying, but then also getting out in the field with the first responders and seeing what works and what doesn't, because everything looks good on paper. And then put into practice, that's two different things, so. Any other areas specific that we would think that we should pay a little bit closer attention to, or we?
I still think you could mitigate more of the road to Farragut. Like they cleared the trees for like 100 feet easy on each side. And there's places you could do that, not
Just
everywhere.
forest management in general of the northern part of the county.
Hear that, Tyre? We need more money.
I'm all about the cut days.
Anyone online have anything to add to this question?
Go to the next.
Okay. So we kind of touched a little bit on this about the lifelines and if they are equipped to handle certain disasters, but just kind of expanding on it a little bit more, are there any additional community lifelines that you perceive are vulnerable according to the risk profile?
I think
Kinda
the
hard to-
communication is the highest.
And do you guys all understand what community lifelines are for this conversation? Community lifelines came out of FEMA a couple years ago, and I know we all might have feelings about FEMA, but this actually is a really good way to think about our community. You take the areas that are vital for our community to function, and then if they are impacted, you start working on how you might mitigate against those things. So, for example, safety and security would involve law enforcement and their activities. If water systems used to be part of food, hydration, and shelter, but then they realized that water systems are so much more than just the hydration aspect. So they pulled that out specifically because water systems are very, well, if we look at what happened in California, they obviously have a big ability to mitigate wildfire spread. And so ensuring that they're able to be operational and used and functional is very important. So if you look at those lifelines, you think about the risks that might impact them, the hazards that might impact them, and then what those impacts to the community could be and how we work to mitigate those impacts as well. So any lifeline that you feel we need to hone in on a little bit or keep in mind as we move forward?
I look at energy, power, and fuel as being pretty critical. Water. And being vulnerable. I know there's mitigation actions going on in a variety of utilities right now, you know, doing the subsurface hardening with their power lines to mitigate wildfire risk, but that's also taking care of some of the other hazards that are such as windstorms and extreme weather. But if you don't have energy, you don't have power, we're gonna be in a world of hurt.
Just don't have any of the rest of it, but.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't have comms, energy and power can't communicate, you
Yeah.
can't reach, and safety and security, these are all affected if you can't speak to each other.
Are there any on here that are not vulnerable?
Well, you know, you're talking about water systems and, you know, I know all of the conversation about the wildfires down in California, but when you have a water system, you only have a pipe that's so big. And if you're trying to draw water from 10 hydrants at the same time, there's no system in the world that's going to be able to keep up with that. It just can't. It's, you know, that's basic physics. So, you know, water systems is important, having backup power to those systems so they can maintain that. But if you have a conflagration, you're going to be SOL anyway.
Tiffany, I know that's with the conversations Tyler and I had about the backup generation for these smaller water systems. Because if we are, as the laws and everything, getting our hands tied with public safety power shutoffs, you're gonna start losing that ability.
And the ability to identify which water systems have that and which ones don't. There's so many small ones out
I
there.
can guarantee you a lot of the small ones don't. Hauser Water that's something when I was on the board, we worked towards was getting generators. We've got two now. We still need a third. But I think these smaller systems, it's just fiscally impossible for them a lot of times to put those in because they need three-phase power, which is expensive. You know, the size of it, depending on their well size. I think that's an important
Does
thing to
water
consider.
systems also include like preventing contamination back into the water system as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that's a big like thing if when a hazard happens, like making sure that doesn't go back into the water system.
Yeah, and that includes wastewater systems too, underwater systems. So anything to do with that world. I know we've had the conversation about small private water systems and their capability. It's just really hard to figure out who's who in the zoo sometimes when it comes to that. So we'll do a little bit more.
Well, and I know the funding aspect for these small water systems, that's a challenge. I know
And it depends how they're organized for them to be eligible for a lot of grants for us, because if they're not a nonprofit organization, they are not able to qualify.
Well, you have a mix of districts that are recognized by the state, just like any other district in the state. And then you have co-ops or associations that are basically your nonprofit ones out there. And there's a variety of those. And then you have the small ones where you might have one trailer park with 80 homes or 85 homes, and they have their own water system.
Yeah.
You know, how do you deal with those folks?
Definitely. Awesome.
Thankfully, we don't have to identify them all because DEQ has them all listed.
We do.
Yeah. DEQ's got that. Also IDWR would have that. I don't, Department of Water Resources.
I do know, like, for example, North Kootenai Water and Sewer applied for hazard mitigation funding and they were awarded, what was it, about $400,000 for backup generation on like 3 to 4 different water systems they operate. We're currently working with them, but the hard part is if those water systems don't identify a mitigation action item and they're not included in the plan, they're not eligible for funding. And so we have reached out to them in the past and provided that information, but I think doing so again might be helpful, so they're aware that they.
Well, and the hard part of that is in order to qualify for a lot of those fundings, they have to have a facility plan. And those can be expensive to develop.
And a 25%.
And they go through
match.
Panhandle Health a lot to help with those.
Yeah, awesome.
Anyone online have anything to add? Okay, so I'm gonna skip this next question because I feel like we've talked a lot about the historical data and things that happen, so I think I've got good content for that. The last question I have for you is what actions do you think individuals, businesses, or local government should take to reduce risks and improve safety? We've already been kind of talking about this. This is the mitigation action item. So any of the threats we've talked about, if there's anything you guys think would be helpful, like we said, generators, you know, any of like that kind of stuff, what do you think we could start implementing as a mitigation action item?
Community of operation plans, I think it's probably one of your areas that lacks most significantly, especially in the business
Continuity of
sector.
operations plans.
Yeah, continuity of operations.
I think maybe reaching out and assisting them with obtaining training that they might want or need. You know, a little more outreach.
I would say interoperability between everybody in here.
Yeah.
Like I was saying, me and the chief over here, we have our departments work very well together. We have very clear defined borders, as Tyler was saying. That's not the case everywhere else, so.
Well, and you know, we've gone towards that because I remember working an incident where I actually was able to get on the sheriff's frequencies, you know, a sub-tactical frequency to help them with traffic control. But how many people actually know that you can do that or how to do that?
Or have the radios to do.
Or have the radios to do. Yeah.
That's a communication critical infrastructure that's
Right.
not even countywide. Most of the rural agencies don't have the funding to be able to get those radios.
Yeah, neither do the highway districts. We were having that last windstorm, you know, we could see the sheriff down there and we need him over here, but we can't.
Can't talk to them.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's important because
We have
that's changed
capture
over the
radio.
years.
We have a cache of radios, so that is something that if we knew some event may be occurring and the highway district felt necessary, we could preemptively deploy those radios.
One of the problems with that though is that the infrastructure has changed due to encryption requirements on both law enforcement and fire?
I don't think it would, I think we would be fine with that problem, but the encryption
It's just
is,
working through and getting the radios that are capable of it. It's not an issue with policy or anything. It's more getting the capability.
And knowing you have those is great. The other one though is like, until our foreman had a Vista's foreman's number in their phone, we couldn't get the power company where we needed them. And they couldn't get us to where they had just cleared the lines to get the trees out of it. You know, it wasn't broke, but it just took longer than it should have.
So kind of just knowing who
Emergency
is who in
contact
this
lists.
zoo we're all operating in and having that face-to-face time to know
Yeah.
what you might need from law enforcement, what law enforcement might need from you, and having a conversation.
I think
about it.
maybe a master list would be a great place to start. Some kind of master list, I don't know.
Emergency contact list. The hard thing with those though, with all the turnover, keeping that updated, that's
the
problem.
maybe jurisdictions should have emergency contact numbers that don't change.
I think that like that historically is a role that emergency management has filled, like keep me
that
as your
looks
one
updated
point of
Rolodex.
contact and I'll do all that crazy organizational work. But if you say, I need the contact for this, I need the contact for KCSO and who's the watch commander on duty, I can get that to you in a
That
second.
conversation all rolls into the IMT that we had the discussion on.
Right. You're just putting more on my plate.
Well,
But
I mean,
yes,
it really does. I mean,
it
that's how
really
that
does.
IMT would work, is to have all those players, have that ability to communicate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. We just have to exercise that muscle, Okay,
You do have one of the lucky resources sitting right in your back door with the interagency
Fire
fire
cash.
center. Cash is available for tapping into. We're working on all hazard
you are?
right now. We're trying to get it figured out, through state legislative policy action.
Well, the cash has supported all hazards in the past.
Yeah, but the billing is problematic.
Yeah, the building.
Yep.
Okay, that's great.
So
to know.
one of the others, I think, that probably needs a refresh at a minimum is that the scale, whatever the disaster is, if you end up with an urban conflagration, there's nothing in this county that's going to be able to address the totality of that disaster. So what are the intergovernmental operability agreements in place, and can they be tapped into? What is the mechanism to bring Benoit County or Shoshone County resources to bear on whatever the disaster is? What's the process of establishing the relationship with the state resources through OEM? Making sure that all of those plans are relevant
And in alignment.
active.
I think your communities are made up of the individuals, right? So you don't have to rescue people from stuff if they're already prepared. So all your Firewise programs, anything you're doing to teach the individuals how to either harden their homes or protect themselves is money well spent.
Community preparedness initiatives and education.
Anyone online have any mitigation items?
Okay, perfect. So these are all great. The reason I'm cutting this off is because you'll have an opportunity to give more information for this. I'm gonna change it up a little bit though and skip ahead and then we'll come back to that. Oh my God. So I just want to reiterate to everybody, it's important that you participate in these meetings. These plans are really not meaningful if we don't have your input from your own communities. We kind of know Kootenai County, but all the intricate areas of it, we can't always get that information unless you guys are providing that input. So I just encourage everybody to keep participating. We're gonna have so many opportunities to have community meetings and to provide feedback digitally to us. You can email us. We're gonna be promoting a lot of this on our social media, on our website. We're gonna do a lot of park engagements out in the public. So just kind of spread this information to your community and bring it back. We're gonna have surveys for everybody to participate in as well, to give all their feedback. That's pretty much all I have. But before you guys leave, and don't think you're gonna do this at the office or at home and return it to me, because I know you all are liars. But go ahead and take a few minutes. When you came in, you've got these two different forms. There's one for hazard identification throughout the county and your communities. You do not have to fill out every single box on this, just whatever hazards are priority and specifically how they impact your community. And then there's this sheet was for mitigation action items. So kind of like what we're talking about, if there's one that you know would be really impactful to your community or for a certain hazard, please fill one of these out for each mitigation item.
Like I said, take a couple minutes to do this and leave them on the table in the back there. There's little
Dropbox.
signs for each one. All this is gonna be compiled into the risk assessment and hazard profile. And before you do leave as well, please make sure you sign in because all this documentation is imperative for backup for our plan. But that's all I have. After you fill these out, you're free to leave. Do you have anything?
I appreciate you guys all giving your input and having this conversation. It's been very helpful for us, and we'll
Great conversation.
take this data, formalize it, and we'll definitely update what the risk assessment looks like. And for those of you who are on a jurisdiction who's participating in the hazard mitigation plan, you received an email from Sarah last week with a lot of attachment and information to provide us and a date to sign up for what meeting. So please, 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 please respond to that email and indicate which meeting you will be attending. So we have everybody participating in the right way. And if you don't know what I'm talking about and you're curious, you can speak to Sarah afterwards and she'll orient you a little bit on that. But we have to have your participation to make this plan meaningful. So we really appreciate it. Have a wonderful Wednesday and please turn in your forms back in the room.
And if you need a pen, I have extra back here.